She was the black sister they rarely spoke about, but at their parents' funeral she stepped forward and revealed a secret no one was prepared for. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish, a quiet, sacred stillness hanging in the air like a veil. Mourners filled the pews in stiff black suits and tear-streaked dresses, whispering condolences, dabbing their eyes, avoiding the kind of silence that made grief feel too real. At the front of the room, a pair of urns sat side by side, one silver, one pearl white, surrounded by framed photos of a smiling couple who in life had been known as David and Margaret Benson, pillars of the community church-going charitable. The kind of people others described as a blessing to all who knew them, but all eyes weren't on the urns, not anymore. They were on her. In the very back of the chapel, standing perfectly still, was a woman in her early 30s. Her skin was a deep, rich brown that caught the light as she stepped from shadow into clarity. Her figure was elegant in a simple black dress, no frills, no flash, just quiet dignity. Her natural hair was pulled into a soft, low puff, and her eyes, they were calm, still like water that had long since stopped expecting anyone to see its depth. Her name was Maya, and she was the Whitmores' adopted daughter, the one no one ever mentioned, unless they had to. She hadn't planned to speak. Fact, most in that chapel had silently hoped she wouldn't. There had been whispers when she walked in, not angry, just curious, discomforted. Is that I didn't know she was coming. They hadn't spoken in years, right? They had all seen the family photos, the Christmas cards, the social media posts, two handsome white sons, Zach and Eli, always front and center, a golden retriever, a backyard barbecue, the perfect family. Maya had never appeared in those pictures, and she had long since stopped expecting to. She was adopted at the age of 7, plucked from the foster care system after losing her biological mother. For a while she believed she'd been saved, chosen even, but over time that belief began to wilt beneath glances that lingered too long, jokes that never quite landed, and silences that screamed louder than words. She wasn't mistreated exactly, not in the way people mean when they say that word, but she wasn't embraced either. She was tolerated, like a guest that overstayed their welcome in a house where the owners didn't know how to ask them to leave. Still she came today, drove across state lines, sat through 2 hours of eulogies of praise and mourning. She listened as Zach spoke about his father's unshakable fairness, and as Eli choked up describing their mother's endless love for family, Maya did not cry. She had done all her crying years ago. And now, to the shock of everyone including her brothers, whose eyes narrowed from the front row, she stepped forward. Each footstep echoed lightly on the polished floor. The heels of her shoes clicked with the kind of calm that made people nervous. As she walked past the rows of faces, some looked away, others stared. A few seemed to hold their breath. When she reached the podium, she didn't touch the microphone, didn't clear her throat. She simply stood still, letting the silence gather around her. She looked out at the room, the same room where she had once been told to smile more in family photos, the room where she had heard relatives whisper, "She's a sweet girl," but the room where her presence had always been too visible and too invisible at the same time. And then, in a voice steady and warm, she said, "Thank you for being here today." Maya had always known that family could be complicated, but what she learned early on was that being adopted and being accepted were not the same thing, not even close. She was 7 the first time she stepped into the Whitmores' suburban home, a 2-story colonial with white shutters, an immaculate lawn, and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. It looked like something out of a magazine. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. Strangers called the Whitmores saints. How wonderful of them, they said, to take in one of those kids. Maya remembered clutching a small backpack and standing in their hallway surrounded by smiling faces. Margaret Benson, polished and pleasant, had knelt in front of her and said, "From now on, you're one of us." "Okay, David." Her husband had ruffled her hair and said, "We don't see color in this house." At 7 years old, Maya didn't fully understand what that meant. By the time she was 10, she did. It meant she was expected to ignore the stares she got when they went to church. It meant pretending not to notice that her brothers Zach and Eli never included her when introducing the family. It meant silence when a visiting uncle made a joke about her growing into that hair. It meant swallowing every ache, every sliver of rejection, because they claimed to love her, and love was supposed to be enough. Zach and Eli were older, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, effortlessly confident. They had the same inside jokes, the same childhood stories, the same photo albums lined with memories Maya wasn't part of. Even when she was in the room, she wasn't in the frame. They never hit her, never said anything overtly cruel. But cruelty has many forms, and indifference is one of the sharpest. At school they ignored her. At home they teased her just enough to sting, always followed by a just kidding or don't be so sensitive. When she tried to speak up, Helen would say, "Boys will be boys," and David would sigh and tell her, "You know they don't mean anything by it." It was gaslight wrapped in a hug, 1,000 tiny cuts with a band-aid and a smile. As Maya grew older, she learned how to be small, not in stature but in presence, how to blend into the background to be quiet when she wanted to scream. She learned how to say thank you, even when it tasted like betrayal on her tongue. And now, decades later, standing in the back of the chapel, nothing had changed. Zach had given her a nod. When she walked in, Eli mumbled a "hey" without making eye contact. Neither offered a seat beside them in the front row. A distant cousin handed her a program without a smile. Another whispered, "I didn't know she was still around. She might as well have been the florist." She sat in the second-to-last pew, surrounded by people who had once called her brave for being adopted, but never belonged to her. Not really. They mourned the same two people she once called Mom and Dad, but their grief came from a place of presence. Hers was more complicated. She mourned not only their deaths, but the love she had chased and never caught. The softness she longed for and was always almost close enough to touch, but never quite. And yet she had come, not because she was expected, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she still remembered being 7, standing in that hallway, believing with all her heart that this would be home. Now, all these years later, she was still trying to figure out if it ever really had been. The eulogies came in waves, each one smoother and more glowing than the last. David and Helen were the kind of couple who opened their home to anyone. They raised their children with such love, a model family kind, welcoming, grounded in faith. The words floated through the chapel like flower petals, light and polished and hollow. Maya sat still, hands clasped gently in her lap, her expression unreadable. To anyone watching, she seemed politely present, perhaps even grateful, but behind her calm exterior memories stirred like dust caught in sunlight. The version of the Whitmores being spoken about was unfamiliar to her, not because they were entirely false, but because they were so carefully edited. No one mentioned the Thanksgiving when she was 12, when Helen insisted on just the core family for the annual photo and guided Maya gently but firmly to sit off to the side. She remembered smiling anyway, trying to make her presence small enough to be invisible, but her hurt large enough to be noticed. It never was. No one mentioned the day David's wallet went missing from the kitchen counter and how the only person asked to empty their pockets had been her. She was 15. She had cried in the bathroom for hours. Later they said they were just being thorough. You know, we had to ask. Sweetheart, we ask everyone. It's not about you. Except it always was. There were no stories about the family trips. She wasn't invited to spring break in Colorado, summer in Maine. She was told the cabin wasn't big enough, that plane tickets were expensive, that it would just be easier this way. And when at 17 she finally told Helen, through trembling lips, "I don't feel like I belong here," the only response she got was, "You've always been a little too emotional, Maya. Try to be grateful." Grateful, that word had followed her for years. It trailed behind every act of dismissal, every act of erasure, reminding her, She was lucky to be here at all. But Maya hadn't come to this funeral out of gratitude. She had come with something else, something heavier than grief, something that had been sealed in silence for too long. In her purse, carefully folded, was a letter, the envelope worn, the ink slightly smudged. She had found it weeks ago in a box of her mother's belongings, tucked behind a jewelry drawer Maya was never allowed to touch. It was addressed in Helen's looping cursive, the name on the front, Maya. She hadn't known it existed, and once she read it she understood why. The letter wasn't long, just 2 pages, but in it Helen wrote what she had never said aloud, not in 30 years of living under the same roof. She apologized for the way she let the boys treat Maya, for the way she pretended not to notice, for the way she used words like colorblind, while silently participating in a system that always made Maya feel like a guest in her own home. Helen admitted that she was scared of being called a bad mother, scared of confronting the ugliness in her own family. She said she had wanted to protect Maya, but that in choosing peace she had chosen silence, and silence in the end had been its own form of betrayal. "You were the bravest one in this family," Helen wrote, "and I should have stood beside you." Maya had read that letter every night since she found it, and now sitting in a chapel full of people who still didn't see her, she knew what she had to do. She hadn't come just to say goodbye. She had come to say something that should have been said long ago, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in truth, because if no one else was going to speak it, she would. And in that moment, Maya's fingers moved silently toward her purse, toward the letter, toward the words that would change everything. The chapel fell into a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Even the air seemed to thicken, holding its breath, as Amara Benson, the sister they never fully embraced, began to walk toward the podium. The clack of her low heels against the polished floor sounded louder than the organ music that had played earlier. Zach and Eli exchanged quick glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and something else, a flicker of unease. Maya moved with a slow, deliberate grace, not hurried, not apologetic, as if she had every right to stand there because she did. When she reached the podium, she placed her hands lightly on either side, grounding herself. She did not clear her throat or fumble with the microphone like so many before her. She simply looked out across the sea of faces, faces that for so long had looked through her rather than at her, and spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, every syllable landing with the quiet weight of a stone dropped into still water. "I was 7 years old when I first walked through the Whitmore's front door." She paused, letting the words settle. "I remember the smell of Mom's perfume. I remember Dad's laugh, loud and sudden like a thunderclap. I remember feeling for the first time in a long time like maybe I had a place." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Zach sat stiffly, arms folded across his chest. Eli stared at the floor. "Growing up, things weren't always easy." Maya continued her tone. "Even I didn't always feel like I fit. Sometimes love was given in ways that were hard to recognize. Sometimes it wasn't given at all." There was no accusation in her voice, no venom, just truth laid bare for anyone brave enough to hear it. Then, with hands that did not tremble, Maya reached into her purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, ink slightly faded. She held it up for a moment, letting everyone see it. "After Mom passed, I found a letter," she said, "written to me." A ripple of whispers traveled through the crowd, but Maya remained steady. She unfolded the paper with care, like it was something fragile and sacred, and she read, "My dearest Maya," the letter began. "I am sorry," simple, direct, and suddenly the room was no longer filled with mourners. It was filled with witnesses. Maya's voice didn't waver as she read Helen's confession aloud. How she regretted standing silent when others made Maya feel less, how she regretted pretending everything was fine instead of confronting the ways Maya had been treated differently, not just by the outside world, but inside their own home, how she had known and done too little. "You deserved better," Helen wrote, "and I should have fought harder for you." Tears welled in the corners of some eyes, though not notably Zach's or Eli's, and just when the weight of the letter seemed almost too much to bear, Maya turned the page and revealed the final part. "I have made arrangements," Helen's letter said, "so that the home you first walked into, the A place you tried so hard to belong, will always belong to you." Maya lowered the paper slowly. "Mom left me the house," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but somehow the loudest sound in the room. Gasps rippled through the pews. Heads snapped toward Zach and Eli, who sat frozen expressions somewhere between shock and indignation. Maya didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply folded the letter again and placed it back into her purse with the same care she might give to tucking in a child. "I didn't come here today for revenge," she said finally, her eyes sweeping across the stunned faces. "I came because I loved them. I came because even imperfect love deserves to be acknowledged. I came because truth deserves a voice, even when it's inconvenient." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy, with the weight of everything unsaid for too long. Maya stepped away from the podium, then her spine straight. Her footsteps, sure she had said what needed to be said, she had honored the truth, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for permission to exist. The chapel remained silent long after Maya stepped down from the podium. No one moved, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment, it was heavier, deeper, the kind of silence that comes when a truth too long buried is finally brought into the light. Maya returned to her seat at the back of the room, her steps as steady as when she had approached. She didn't look at Zach. She didn't look at Eli. It didn't matter anymore. She hadn't spoken for them. She had spoken for herself and for the little girl. She used to be the one who had once sat quietly on the porch swing, clutching a teddy bear too tight, wishing someone would tell her she belonged. As the service continued, Maya sat with a calm she hadn't known she was capable of. She listened as the pastor offered final blessings, as the organ hummed a low, solemn tune. But none of it washed over her the way it used to. She felt anchored now, grounded, because today she had chosen truth over comfort and forgiveness over bitterness. When the final amen was whispered and the congregation slowly rose to their feet, Maya remained seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of the day settle into her bones. People began filing out, some darting glances in her direction, others deliberately looking away. A few offered small, tight smiles that tried and failed to bridge years of silent distance. Maya returned their gazes with polite nods. Nothing more. She owed no one anything. Zach and Eli lingered at the front, speaking in low, tense voices with the estate attorney. She caught a glimpse of Eli's face, pale tight with confusion and anger, and Zach's jaw set in a hard line. They hadn't known, they hadn't seen it coming, and now they had to live with it, just as she had lived with their indifference for years. But Maya didn't revel in their discomfort. She didn't feel triumphant, only free. As she stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, a warm breeze lifted the hem of her black dress. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the sunlight kiss her skin. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying anyone else's expectations. She wasn't carrying shame that wasn't hers to bear. She wasn't carrying the heavy, invisible weight of needing to prove she deserved her place. She carried only herself, and that was enough. Before she left the chapel, steps she turned back once, not with sadness, but with a quiet, steady gratitude. They had tried to erase her from their story, tried to write her in the margins, to crop her out of the frame, to fold her existence neatly out of sight, but in the end, she was the one who finished it.